I don't want to hide from you that there is one passage in the Talmud Yerushalmi, which we now call, I don't know, we used to call it the Palestinian Talmud, because that phrasing doesn't work as well anymore to call it the Palestinian Talmud as it used to in the old days. But from the Yerushalmi, passage number 11, it talks about a guy named Yaakov Ish Kfar Leburaya, Jacob, a man of the village called Leburaya. He went to Tyre, that's a city in Syria, and people came and asked him the following question: can you perform the circumcision of the son of a non-Jewish woman? That is to say, a kid who's going to convert, born to a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother. Can you do the circumcision on Shabbos? That was the question. You know that the circumcision of a Jewish kid, it gets done even on Shabbos, right? So the question was, if I need to do this conversion to convert the kid, can I do it on Shabbat? So he answered, he thought he should permit it, based on the verse in the book of Numbers that says, and they were counted in their families by their father's house. Listen, everybody, that's the advocacy of patrilineal descent. That's the advocacy of patrilineal descent. He was going to allow this kid to be circumcised on Shabbat because of patrilineal descent. A guy named Rabbi heard this decision, and he said, bring him and we're going to whip him. Beat him. So Yaakov Ish Leburaya says to him, and where are you getting off beating me for? On what basis are you beating me? This is another way of asking, what's the source? How do you know that I mean, why were you saying that I'm wrong? Give me the verse. So he says, and he quotes the verse from Ezra that says, let's kick out all these women. That's the basis on which I'm going to whip you. To which he answers and he says, and you're telling me that the book of Ezra has the authority of the Torah? The book of Ezra is not Torah. Where's the Torah law that says this? He says, oh no, you're wrong. It does have the authority of Torah. Because the end of the verse, in that verse in Ezra, says, and let it be considered like Torah. To which he answered and said, that's what you call Torah? So ultimately, he says, my ultimate proof is from what Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, you should not intermarry with them. Ultimately, what he said is, okay, whip me. It's better than that the people should be liable for execution for desecrating the Sabbath by performing the circumcision. So what am I showing you this source for? It is, to the best of my knowledge, the only rabbinic source from the Mishnah to this day that seems to advocate the patrilineal principle. And the ending of that passage says that he gave up and said, even I won't do it that way. So I now reiterate to you that in point of fact, there seem to be no sources from the rabbinic period that have any claim about patrilineal descent and any Jewish sources. And now I make the following statement to you. What are, Shia Cohen said at the end, historians want to find out the truth of history. Legalists want to decide the law. He's the historian. I try to be objective and report to you what I think the history is. And I hid nothing from you. And now I need to talk to you as a legalist. I want to make one point to this group that I made to the earlier group, that I want you to sort of understand it, because only yesterday did it occur to me that I really have to make this clear to you, right? I, who grew up in America, or had I grown up, let's say, in Great Britain, or had I grown up in France, would have been used to legal systems that were long-term. You didn't have the army killing the president and having a coup every few years, right? You know, the United States had a revolution against Great Britain, but since the revolution, it's worked the same way. Right? Now, we did have a civil war. I'm not saying we didn't have a civil war, but the legal system has worked the same way. Governments in Great Britain may collapse too fast, but the system works the same way. Right? In Latin America, not that I know its history very well, so if I'm entirely wrong, you will let me know. It doesn't, you're not accustomed to that. You know, every few years the army takes over. Right? Kick out the president, kill him, put him away, do something. Right? And then sometimes you slap him back out again because he was popular with the people. Right? In the meantime, the army took over, and you're not accustomed to thinking about legal systems as long-term stable. The Jewish legal system is that, though. It is stable over a very long term. Over a very long term. And that long term of the supremacy of the rabbinic tradition as the only authentic Judaism, that goes back a long way. Listen, I have to tell you something. Early Christians thought they were Jewish. You know when we broke with early Christians? Not over the belief in Jesus as the Messiah. We didn't like that. But that's not why Jews and Christians broke. You know why they broke? Because St. Paul went to preach to the Gentiles. And he said to the Gentiles, you can become Christian without first becoming Jewish. Until Paul went to preach to the Gentiles, if you wanted to be a Christian, you had to convert to Judaism. Then you could become a Christian. Paul changed that. Paul changed that. So what I'm trying to say to you, at least at this moment, is there isn't one stitch of evidence that I can find from the beginning of the Common Era to this, well, till within the last 50 years, of any Jewish community that did anything but define Jewishness matrilineally. For almost 2,000 years, Judaism has defined Jewishness matrilineally. I may not be sure why we adopted that. I can give you the theories. I can tell you which ones I think are weak and which ones I think are strong. But the legal fact is absolutely clear to me. Point 2. As a legalist, it is always clear to me that the precedent stands unless there is compelling reason for the precedent not to stand. That is, the proof of the desirability of changing the precedent has to be given by those who favor changing the precedent. Otherwise, the precedent should stand. In law books, this is called the principle of stare decisis. That is to say, the decision stands. The decision stands. Next point. The one who changes the decision is responsible for the consequences of changing the decision. The one who changes the precedent is responsible for what the consequences of having changed the precedent. So now, allow me to distinguish between different types of changes. Let me distinguish between different types of changes for you. I believe that it is perfectly Jewishly, legally acceptable to call women to the Torah. I recognize that that is a change from what is the precedented behavior since the period of the Talmud. There's virtually no question that women were not called to the Torah from the period of the Talmud until 50 years ago. I guess it's 70 years ago anyway. But the long-term consequences of that are minimal. If my kid doesn't like going to a shul where women are called to the Torah, he'll go to another shul. His life is not negatively, adversely affected in an almost irremediable way by my decision to call women to the Torah. If I let women count in a minyan, and I think I have halachic justification for that, and my son or my children or my grandchildren decide that isn't for them, they'd rather be Chabad, so they go to Chabad. And it's not an issue. It's not an issue. The thing about which it seems to me Jews have been exceptionally careful for all of our history is virtual unity on who's a member of the tribe. All of our other differences, we can fight like the Dickens. But we have been united, to the best of my knowledge, on the issues of who is a member of the tribe, and at least for 1800 years. I said earlier today that I recognize the right of the Reform movement to be ideologically consistent with the ideology of the Reform movement. I recognize the right of the Orthodox world to be ideologically consistent with the ideology of the Orthodox world. I, of course, recognize their right to do that. That does not mean that I accept as acceptable for me what some other group does in ideological consistency for themselves. So I now make the following claim to you. The reason I mentioned the Christians to you a few minutes ago is in order to make the following statement, and you're going to hate me. No, you won't hate me, you'll hate the statement. Unless the statistics are wrong, my guess is that currently there are in the world between 300,000 and 400,000 people who have converted to Judaism. And 90% of them were converted by Reform rabbis. At this moment, there are approximately, I mean, I am not a sociologist, I haven't done a current study, but my guess is that there are between 220,000 and 300,000 people in the world who call themselves Jewish on the basis of the Jewishness of their father, whose mothers are not Jewish and who have not converted. Pardon?
They didn't convert.
Yes, and they did not convert. I think there are close to 300,000 such people in the world today. 300,000. Now think back to the Christian days. For a generation or two, if my son then fell in love with some girl whose family was Christian, I could still investigate. The girl who called herself Christian, was her mother Jewish? Was her grandmother Jewish? And she just calls herself Christian because she believes in the Messiahship of Jesus, but she's Jewish? I could check that. How many generations do you think you can check that? You cannot check that beyond 3 or 4 generations. There's no way. We don't keep such genealogical records. Certainly not of what were the religions of these people. Do you know what I think we're headed for? We're headed for the same horrendous decision. Now, I don't think it's going to happen in the lifetime of anybody in this room right now. Right? I don't think it will happen in the lifetime of anybody in this room right now. But in the lifetime of the grandchildren of the youngest people in this room, it will already have happened. We are headed for the point at which some decision is going to have to be made, like the decision that the rabbinic tradition made about Christians. When it got to the point that it was no longer possible to determine whether or not somebody who called themselves Christian was Jewish, the rabbis had to make a decision. Either we give up and we say anybody who calls himself Christian we call Jewish, or we say anybody who calls himself Christian we say is not Jewish and has to convert.